get out of the way, I'm going to let Vivian welcome you, and then we will get this show started.
Yes, I am Vivian Van Norwick, and I have the privilege of serving as your lay leader this year for our Court Streeters. I want to welcome you all that are gathered here, all of those who are gathered online, and I see that we have some guests with us from community agencies and other churches, and we're just very glad that you are here and can participate in this discussion with us. So the discussion is shelter from the storm. What does all of that mean? Well, and who's involved? The storm is impending mass deportation. And why are we involved? We're United Methodists. Of course we're involved. John Wesley was a public justice advocate. And why here at Court Street? Because it's part of our creed. It defines who we are. No one should have to walk through the storm alone. So that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So, Pastor, would you please introduce our guest speaker?
I would be happy to. Thank you. So now that she's welcomed you, now I get to reiterate the welcome, and particularly welcome to our neighbors. Flint is such a neat place, filled with so many justice-minded people. It is so good to see so many churches represented in the room today, and I know that many other churches around the state are represented online. Just a word about online participation. If you are streaming with us on Facebook, we do have somebody watching our Facebook stream in the comments, and so if you'd like to ask a question of Dr. Jill later on when we have our question time, just type your question into the comments, and there's somebody in the room here who can write that down, and we'll be able to pass it on later on. Those who are in the room will have an opportunity to ask questions as well, either with your own voice, or I'm happy to give you some paper and you can write it down and pass it forward when we come to that point. So again, welcome to everybody. Thank you for being part of God's response to the things that are happening in the world right now. I want to introduce our special guest today. Reverend Dr. Jill Hardt-Zundel is one of my clergy heroes. Dr. Jill is a retired United Methodist elder. She served 5 different churches during her career in the United Methodist Church, most recently Detroit Central United Methodist Church, right in downtown Detroit, just across the street from Comerica Park. You might park in their parking lot when you go to games down in Detroit. Dr. Jill has degrees from Asbury College and Asbury Seminary, although I think she gave back at least one of those in an act of protest, because that's the kind of person Dr. Jill is. She has a reputation for courage and a reputation for justice ministries, particularly in the area of immigration. This is one of those areas of ministry that she feels passionate about, that she is well educated and well versed in. And as we looked towards what might happen in this year and in future years, as headlines started talking about mass deportations, as I realized I don't know the things I need to know to lead in our community and to care for our neighbors right now, the person I realized I wanted to talk to and the person I realized I needed to be in conversation with was Dr. Jill. And I said, rather than just take her out for coffee and have that conversation all by myself, I'm going to invite Dr. Jill to come and talk to people at Court Street and anyone else who might be interested. And I've asked her to do a couple things for us today. I've asked her to please tell us a little bit about her experience as the pastor of a sanctuary church in downtown Detroit. She has experience with sanctuary ministries, even ongoing right now at this moment. I've asked her to share a little bit of that experience with us, and I've asked her to share with us some things that we should be thinking about, we can be preparing for, we can be doing right now to care for our neighbors in this community who may be facing deportation, who may be afraid because they've been made to feel afraid, and people who are afraid to leave the house and go to public spaces right now. How can we be better neighbors to them? I've asked Dr. Jill to help us start to think some of that through. She's come up from Detroit. She's been here all day. She had lunch over at Westside. She's having a blast in Flint. And so please, even though she's been here all day already, would you please help me welcome the Reverend Dr. Jill Hardt-Zundel.
Thank you. It is good to be back here with you. One of the things, I did this presentation for the first time last week in Big Rapids, and what I said to them, I will say to you. When I was in college, there was someone who said to me, "You are more of an expert by how far you drove." So I drove an hour. Last week I drove 3.5 hours. I am not an expert on immigration, but it is something that I am very passionate about and something that I've been dealing with probably the last 10 years. So I want to give a little background. We can go to the next slide. A little background on how I started in this. When I was in my second appointment at Hazel Park United Methodist Church, I was being trained to be a docent at the Holocaust Center in Farmington Hills. And I was shadowing the docent. And we were taking a group of businessmen around the Holocaust Center. And the docent knew that I was a pastor. And one of the businessmen asked this question: where were the churches when this was going on? And he said, "Well, that's a great question, Jill. Where were the churches when this was going on?" And I didn't have an answer because they weren't there. And that has always kind of stayed with me. And when I think about mass deportations, that's what was going on during the Holocaust as well. And so that is kind of my motivation as I constantly hear that question: where were the churches? And it goes into where will the churches be? Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of sanctuary. In all three major religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, there is always a place of sanctuary, a place that people could come and feel safe and feel heard. If you remember, in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, says the foreigner residing among you must be treated as a native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. And then also Jesus said, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. So next slide. Talking a little bit about the root causes of migration, especially in Central America, which are the more famous people coming into our country. They leave their communities because of violence. The countries of the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, are continuously plagued by violence, crime, and it's extremely dangerous to live there, especially for children and young adults. They're also fleeing domestic violence, lack of economic opportunities, they're fleeing gangs, they're fleeing drugs, and they don't have protection from their government. So that is why they're trying to find safety in our country. Next slide. This is how you become a citizen. How many of you have ever heard, why don't they just come here legally? How many times? Those are the different ways that you can do that, and understand that any of those ways cost tens of thousands of dollars. So let's talk, next slide, a little bit about how people can come in here. The first one, if you can hit the next thing, is employment-based immigration. Foreign workers who have job offers from an eligible employer can come into our country. But there are also investor visas for entrepreneurs who create jobs are allowed to come into our country. Next one. Okay, let's do refugee asylum. Those people are coming into the United States and declaring that they are seeking asylum. And if you've heard that before, understand that that is a legal way to enter the country, no matter what you're hearing right now. Coming in and declaring that you are seeking asylum is a legal way. You have to go through a checkpoint and present before a judge. And then that judge determines if you can move forward on your case. But that takes years to process. The next one is family-based immigration, and that is you can come in if you have a sponsor that's an immediate relative of yours, or if they're a lawful resident right now, they can sponsor you. And then the last one is a diversity lottery known as a green card lottery. This is a yearly lottery that awards a limited number of immigrant visas to people from countries with low immigration rates to the United States. And you must have a high school diploma, and fewer than 1 in 400 applicants receive this visa. And since I made this, let's talk about that new way you can come in for $5 million. You can get a gold visa. And that's all I'm going to say about that one. But if you see, there are no low-skill visas. There are no visas for farm workers or factory workers. There are people that are looking to hire those kind of workers to come in, but there's no legal visa way to get those low-wage workers in. Okay, next slide. I think it's really important that we talk a little bit about facts. And this comes from the book, The Truth About Immigration. Increases in undocumented immigration in any given state has no impact on the rate of violent crimes such as murder, rape, robbery, or assault, nor do they impact property crimes such as burglary, theft, or arson. Next slide. A synthesis of 51 different studies covering the period 1994 to 2014 concluded that immigration does not contribute to crime. If anything, it slightly reduces it. This also applies to undocumented immigrants. People who have traveled and paid coyotes thousands of dollars to come here are not going to mess it up. They want their places where they live to be safe because they fled other places that they were terrified in. So they try to make the communities that they are in more stable and more safe. Next slide. The most updated Texas study, which covered the years 2012 to 2018, is that relative to undocumented immigrants, U.S.-born citizens are over 2 times more likely to be arrested for violent crimes, 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for drug crimes, and over 4 times more likely to be arrested for property crimes. Think about what you're hearing on the news, and then think about those facts. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Central American Solidarity Movement, and that's really when the sanctuary movement started in 1982, when 6 churches offered to provide sanctuary to Central Americans. The movement was a response to difficult immigration policies that made it hard for Central Americans to get asylum. Churches provided shelter, food, legal advice, and protection to refugees. The movement raised awareness about the human rights abuses and violence in Central America. It challenged the U.S.-backed violence in Central American countries. In 1990, Congress passed legislation that allowed the president to grant temporary protective status, which you might hear as TPS, to groups in need. So the countries that were under that protection were Afghanistan, Burma, Cameroon, El Salvador, Ethiopia, Haiti, and Honduras. And as you may be aware, Trump has just taken away temporary protective status for Haitians. Next slide. Here are the current threats that we are facing. The executive order on mass deportations. A lot of people voted for Trump because he was going to get, the criminals out, right? And our country would be safe again. But people didn't realize that their neighbors, who they've been living next to for 20 years, they were defined as criminals because they came here without documentation. So anyone without documentation is therefore by this administration labeled as a criminal. The Laken-Riley Act, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Laken-Riley Act. Laken-Riley was a young college student who was murdered by an undocumented immigrant here in the U.S. The Laken-Riley Act is a United States law that both of our senators voted for that requires the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to detain undocumented immigrants admitting to, charged with, or convicted of theft-related crimes, assaulting a police officer, or a crime that results in death or seriously bodily injury like drunk driving. But here's the issue for that. There is a no bond detention solely based on the charge, so there is no due process, which means prolonged detention without a bail or a bond hearing. It risks the prolonged detention of people innocent of the charges. Under this bill, immigration authorities would be required to take a person into immigration custody after a theft-related arrest, even if a criminal judge found them to present no risk and released them on bail. The next one, canceling DACA, Deferred Arrival of Children Act. That would affect thousands of young people who came with their parents as children, and this is the only country that they really know. And they were protected by that act, which is being taken away. And so they would be subject to deportation back to a country where they probably don't even speak the language. Ending birthright citizenship. The 14th Amendment grants those who are born in the United States as United States citizens. And now they're trying to take that away as well. If you are born to undocumented parents, you don't have a right to be a United States citizen anymore. And then I think the one that we're all here to talk about today is no safety for sensitive locations. Schools, hospitals, and places of worship used to be places that ICE would not enter. There wasn't a law, there was an understanding. And those now ICE can come in at any time. There have been lawsuits, and the Quakers and the Sikhs just won their lawsuit. The United Methodist Church is among many that are also filing suit. Because it's not just about ICE coming into the church, it's about people feeling safe in worship. People feeling part of their community, that they can come in and be a part of their community that they've always known, and not worry about if they go into church, will they be deported. Okay, next slide. So, Detroit Central has been a sanctuary church since 2017. The first public sanctuary case that we did is Dead and Flora Ranksbergai from Albania. They had been in the country for 20 years. They had applied for asylum and had been denied. And then while they were appealing their denial, Flora was diagnosed with MS. So she is in a wheelchair, and Dead is her main caregiver. When Trump became president the first time, he was to be deported. And so we were approached by Michigan United, which is an organization that does peace and justice work, to ask if we would house him. So Martin Luther King Sunday is when he moved into the church. ICE had asked him to come in for an interview, one more interview, and his lawyer told him absolutely not, because if you go, they'll detain you. So they moved into the church, which the lawyer told me would be a couple of months. 3.5 years they lived in the church. Dead could not leave the building with threat of deportation. They had 2 sons. Lawrence, who was born in Albania, was a DACA recipient, and their son Eric, who was born here in the States. We had to make this very public. We did a press conference because we were accused of harboring a fugitive, of which we responded, we're not harboring anybody. You know exactly where he is. We just told you. So I'll talk a little bit when I talk about how you do sanctuary, about the different things that we did with the Ranksbergai family. They are under temporary protective status. His case almost went to the Supreme Court. And the only guarantee that we could get was a temporary protective status where every single month he must check in with ICE for the rest of his life in order to stay here. But now, because temporary protective status isn't guaranteed, he might be deported. Next slide. Pierre Noella Daisy Owen Mail from Cameroon. They came to us from an immigration attorney who asked if we could house them, and they were there for a year. They were seeking asylum. He had spoken out against his country in Cameroon and been beaten with steel rods, and he had the scars to prove it. So they are now living in Grosse Pointe and doing very well. Next slide. The last family is still living in our church, Dauda, Zaatia, and Hassan from the Ivory Coast. When they moved in, she was pregnant with Hassan, and today is his 2nd birthday, so you know how long they've been living there. They had their asylum hearing 2 weeks ago, and there was a snowstorm. So we did not have a hearing, and we have to wait now till July. One of the things that's really important to understand is there's not a lot of immigration judges. And the Trump administration just fired 20 of them. So when you have an immigration hearing now, it's on Zoom because there's not enough. So their judge is actually located in Chicago. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about public sanctuary and what that means there's public sanctuary and private sanctuary. Public sanctuary means a faith community invites a family who's been previously identified to live on the premises. And then they run a public campaign to demand relief for the family. That means news stories, that means protests, that means whatever way you can get their story out. And so hopefully that campaign helps the family, but it also helps change politics too. But like I said with Ded and Flora, understand that if you decide to do that, you are taking on the obligation to house a family and run an advocacy campaign for them. Don't worry, you can do it, but understand that it is a lot of work. One of the main things that I didn't have to do at Detroit Central, because that's who Detroit Central is we never took a vote to become a sanctuary church. It's just who we are. But that's an important part, that you have buy-in from the congregation that we're about to do this. Next slide. Private sanctuary, and we did this with the very first family that we had before Ded and Flora, is a faith community identifies a family but does not make the case public. They're just living in the church. Private sanctuary is often a step that is taken before taking the campaign public. And this puts pressure on the government, because then you can say, we need you to close this case of this sympathetic family, or we're going to go public with the horrible things that you're doing. Next slide. So if you're going to house an immigrant or an immigrant family, they need to have a place away from the entrance of the church. They need to have access to the shower or kitchen facilities. You have to do a ton of fundraising. When Ded and Flora lived there, he couldn't leave the church, so they had no money coming in. So we had to do constant fundraising to get his story out. And we had to do grocery shopping for them, because Flora couldn't drive anymore and Ded couldn't leave the church. A listening ear. We had a saying, sanctuary is hard. It's hard on the church, is especially hard on the family. And when you are locked up in a building for 3.5 years, it's extremely, extremely hard. And so sometimes they need to vent, and sometimes they're going to scream at you because you're the person in the room. But they definitely need a listening ear. And the last one, my husband reminded me to put down, drive children to school, because when Eric was living in the church, he was going to school in Southgate. So we had to have somebody pick him up every morning from the church and take him to school and pick him back up. Okay, next slide. So how do we do this? Step 1, figure out who you're going to work with. Are there lawyers? We work with an immigration attorney. Are there community groups? We did not pick somebody off of the street. We had them vetted. So we knew that we were getting somebody that we didn't have to worry about that was going to be entering our community. So what is your criteria? Is it an imminent threat? Are they threatened right now with deportation and you need to take them in right away? Is that some of the criteria? Do they have a criminal history? If they have a criminal history, what is that history and how far are you willing to go with that? Are they willing to go public? It's much easier to get this case heard if a lot of people hear about it. If you're keeping it secret, no one will know, and there's no way to put pressure on the government if nobody knows that they're in your building. And do they have a sympathetic story? Dad and Flora definitely had a sympathetic story with her being in a wheelchair and him being the main caregiver. Next slide. Step 1.5, faith leaders and family have clear conversation with each other about expectations. The first thing that Dad did was he came into the church and looked at the space, because this is a space he didn't know how long he was going to be living in, and it was up to him to make that decision. It wasn't up to us. It must be clear that the family is in charge of decisions regarding entering or leaving sanctuary, because sometimes sanctuary is too hard and they just want to go. They're just done. If there's major developments in the campaign, they need to be the ones making that decision, and that was something we didn't know how to do, to be honest. As soon as we went public with Dad and Flora, we got $10,000 in one day. But we kept the $10,000 and gave them little bits of it, which made them feel really awful. And so we learned that that's their money and they need to have control over that instead of us. So that was one of the learning things that we had when we first moved them in. Next slide. So once that you bring that family in, you need a human services team to be pulled together to figure out what their needs are. And then if you are the church housing them, you absolutely have to have allies that do the work together. And so once you bring that family in, you need to let the allies know that you have a family in there. And then the family and the teams will meet together to figure out how we're going to get this information out about the church. What parts of their story do they want shared publicly? What parts do they want to keep to themselves? There's often no formal way to resolve a case, but immigration law has a lot of discretion. A prosecutor can choose to close many cases on their own volition. So an immigration lawyer sometimes might just sit down with the prosecutor and say, look, man, this is what's going on. Is there any way that you can drop this case? Next slide. This is negotiation. Campaign leaders, allies, and legal team present ICE with an ultimatum. Close this case or we're going to go public with it. Most cases do not have a clear legal avenue, so we are generally asking for discretion. What can you do to help this family, which is how we got to the temporary protective status for debt. Next slide. Campaign launched. Family and congregation and the organization come together and make a plan. And then the allies are activated. This can mean and should have local politicians and other supportive congregations to be a part of this. Then there's a big press announcement, a rally, where you have to invite everybody so that they show and stand behind you as you're doing this press conference that we are going to protect this family from separation no matter what. Pressure campaign on ICE and Trump. So you do petitions, you make phone calls, you do vigils, you do a march, you have an online and social media presence, you make their own social media Facebook page is what Keep the Ranksburg Eye Family Together was a place that everybody could go to every single day to see developments. So that's step 4. Next slide. Step 4, you repeat it until you win. So it's not just a one-time thing. You have to keep doing it over and over and over again. Next slide. It does cost a lot of money to do this. There are grants in the United Methodist Church up to $2,000 for local projects that assist refugees and migrants. So there are ways to get some dollars. Troy First just got one to help house a family with furniture and that kind of stuff. Okay, next slide. So what if you can't house a family in your house of worship? You can join together with other churches that can and have the facilities to do that. I know of no other church in the state of Michigan that has a 4-bedroom apartment like we do in Detroit Central. So, Faith Community agrees to help the congregation actually hosting the family with logistics and advocacy because it is exhausting to be fighting with ICE and to be doing press conferences and to be doing all of that. And to be honest, the pastor of the church is the face of the church. So a lot of time that burden falls on the pastor to be doing that. So the faith community, all of those, the people who are housing it, all of the allies get together. They meet with Congress to oppose funding for enforcement, get cities to pass welcoming resolutions. One of the ways, East Lansing just now became a sanctuary city, which flies in the face of everything that's going on right now, because they'll probably be threatened with their federal funding taken away. But a sanctuary city means that your local law enforcement will not cooperate with ICE, and they will not house anyone in their jails that's detained by ICE. Education is important for members to understand all of the different avenues of immigration and all of the misinformation that's going out. And then we need people to participate in immigration advocacy efforts. So if you hear about a bill like the Lake and Riley bill, to call, to meet with face-to-face with your representatives, to have those kind of conversations. Those are the things that can really help a church that's actually housing a family right now. Next slide. Other ways that you can do this is you can actually go down to the border. I am the person in the red. Right there, we went down to the border with the Board of Church and Society. The Quakers actually had a time where clergy could come down, and there were over 500 of us that walked down to the border to make witness to what was going on at the border. And when we were there, we didn't see people climbing over the fences or coming through the ocean. What we saw were people gathering on the other side of that fence with a mariachi band to play for us. So that was amazing. But if you get an opportunity to go to the border, to actually lay your eyes on what's going on down there. And the other picture you'll see is there was a worship service where the clergy were invited to come and wash the feet of the migrants that were there. Next slide. Another way that we drew attention to Ded and Flora's case was we walked from Detroit to Lansing. Took 6 days. We probably did 15 to 20 miles a day, but every single night we stopped at another house of worship and told their story. And then we actually FaceTime with Ded and Flora so they could talk about their story as well. And we had different people from the community joining us every single day. We walked through Howell, which was a little scary, but every other place was very welcoming. Okay, next slide. Okay, legal questions, remembering that I am not a lawyer. Are we breaking the law? The definition of harboring depends on who you ask. But the new border czar says anyone harboring an immigrant will be charged with a felony. But no congregation or individual has been prosecuted recently. 1986, the sanctuary trials indicted 17 movement members. 8 were convicted of smuggling and were given suspended sentences, but it is great publicity for your church. Next slide. Another policy advocacy is talking again, like I said, about talking to your local police. We went to the Wayne County Sheriff, who was Benny Napoleon at the time, and asked him please not to cooperate with ICE and using the sheriff's office. And he said, I don't have enough sheriffs to do what I need to do, let alone help ICE. So he guaranteed us he would not be detaining anybody for ICE, and he would not be helping ICE arrest anybody. Okay, next slide. Know your rights. Everyone has constitutional rights. Not every citizen, everyone. You have the right to due process, the right to be free of unreasonable searches and seizures. You have the right to legal counsel, the right to remain silent, right to not self-incriminate, right to a jury trial, right to Miranda warnings, right to defend against deportation, and right to payment for work. And then I'm sure you've heard, I hope that you've heard about the Fourth Amendment protection. Fourth Amendment protection. All people, not just citizens, all people have a reasonable expectation of privacy. ICE and Customs and Border Patrol are the two agencies under the Department of Homeland Security that arrest people. The rules for immigration agents differ from rules for the police because ICE and CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, are both administrative agencies enforcing civil law and not criminal law. Okay? Next slide. What if ICE violates these rights? It is helpful in an immigration case if there is a record of a violation, like a video or a photo. So if something is happening and somebody is breaking the law, if the ICE agent is breaking the law, knocking down the door after you haven't given them consent, you need to videotape that, take pictures, and that may result in the court telling ICE that they cannot engage in that behavior anymore. Now, ICE will lie to get consent to try to get into a home, a church, a school. They may say they are the police. They may say they are the FBI. But you should never, ever open the door to them. Because if you open the door to them, it can be seen as an invitation as you are giving consent for them to come in. So if they have a warrant, then you ask them to slip it underneath the door or hold it up to the window. But never, ever open the door. Next slide. There are two different kinds of warrants. There is a judicial warrant and an administrative warrant. The only one that you should be concerned about is a judicial warrant that is signed by a judge. An administrative warrant is from Homeland Security to arrest any undocumented immigrant. It is non-binding. It is signed by an agent, not a judge. It has not been seen by a judge. And when I was in a training with a lawyer, she said it could be an ICE agent in one cubby talking to an ICE agent in the other cubby saying, hey, will you sign this warrant? It means nothing. So what you're looking for is a judicial warrant that will say something like United States District Court and then been signed by a judge on the bottom. Okay, next slide. Civil rights basics. You need to ask to see the warrant. Do not consent to a search. Do not present fake documents. Remain silent. Record everything. Like I said before, if they come to the door of a home or a church or a school and they say they have a warrant, you ask to see that warrant. Make sure again that it is a judicial warrant signed by a judge. Now the same lawyer who said when you get the warrant, especially if you were at a church and they're trying to come in, you look at the warrant, you say, I'm sorry, I'm not an attorney. I'm not sure what this says. If you could come back another time, that would be really helpful. But I'm not going to allow you to come in today. Next slide. Border zones. If you live within 100 miles of the border, you are within the border zone. So if you look up there, you notice Michigan, the entire state, is a border zone, which means that anywhere in Michigan you can be stopped and asked about your immigration status. You have to show immigration status, and you may have your car searched without any reason. Okay, next slide. Think about your place of worship. Are there private places and public spaces? I would say the sanctuary and the fellowship hall are public places. Offices and Sunday school rooms might be private places because only certain people can enter there. Without a warrant, ICE and Customs and Border Patrol cannot enter private spaces. So it's important to mark very clearly with signs what is a public space and what is a private place. And then you need to create a protocol on how you will ask ICE and CBP to leave. And when you ask Ask with kindness and not aggression, because things could escalate quickly. Choose 1 or 2 people who will be the ones authorized to give consent for ICE or CBP to enter the building. Next slide. So it's very helpful to have signage on all doors, like I said, making public places and private spaces. Be careful, especially if you are a church that does live stream, who you are filming, especially when communion is happening and people are coming up front. Live streaming is very public, and we don't know who's watching those. So you might want to just take a picture of the altar and leave that up there when communion is happening, making sure that nobody is filmed. This sign here is from Harvard Epworth United Methodist Church, where my daughter Clara used to go in Boston. And it says, "This is a private place. ICE and Homeland Security may not enter without a judicial warrant signed by a judge." Detroit Central has that, as well as a QR code that goes to the ACLU Know Your Rights website. So that's a really important thing that will give them, I hope, pause into entering your space. Next slide. Protecting congregants. If you have undocumented congregants, it's so important to have a plan. And whatever your plan is, you should communicate it clearly with all employees and your congregation. Designate 1 person to look at any warrant. Employees should advise congregants of their right to remain silent and to request an attorney. Employees should never ever lie about the whereabouts of a congregant, because that could carry criminal penalties. Wanted to share a story of what happened one time when we thought ICE had come into our building. It was shortly after Trump said he was going to start coming into hospitals and schools and churches. I told my building superintendent, if ICE comes into the building, I want you to let me know, no matter what's happening in worship. So I was in the middle of preaching, and I heard, "Reverend Jill, Reverend Jill." And so I turned around, and he said, "ICE is here." So I looked at the congregation, and I said, "Okay, start praying." And I went out into the lobby, looking really bold but shaking to death on the inside. And I said, "Can I help you?" And it was a Detroit police officer looking for someone. I said, "So you're not ICE?" "No." So I just went like that, like, "I can't deal with you right now." Walked back into the sanctuary. And when I walked back in, the entire congregation had surrounded Deb and Flora. Like, they were going to have to come through that entire congregation. So that was a pretty powerful moment. Next slide. So have a sample ICE safety plan. Office staff, do not give consent to enter. Advise ICE, I'm sorry, I'm just following protocol. And contact the designated person who is supposed to respond. And building administration, immediately place the congregants on notice if ICE is present. Notify ICE that you can't answer any questions about specific congregants without a judicial warrant. One of the things that we're doing with the family that we have now is they're on the 5th floor in an apartment that is really hard to find. But there's also a back staircase. So if they come in, if ICE comes in one way, we have a way for them to go out a different way. So try to figure out those ways that if ICE is coming through this door and you know that you have an undocumented immigrant in your congregation, how are you going to get them out? Or where are you going to hide them? Next slide. Emergency checklist. So let's say you've got parents who are undocumented and they drop their child off to the nursery and go into worship. ICE comes in and takes them, and that child is still in the nursery. What do? One of the things that we do with the families that we work in is we fill out paperwork for temporary guardianship, so that if you are detained, what do you want us to do with your children? Work with your immigrant congregants to do powers of attorney. Again, delegation of temporary guardianship should they be detained. That's why a lot of children in Southwest Detroit are not going to school right now, because they're afraid that when they get home, their parents aren't going to be there. And then have a safe place for all the documents. Have them tell you where their documents are. So if they are detained, you know where their paperwork is. Also, if you know someone who has work papers, it doesn't do any good if they leave their work papers at home and go to work. I had a phone call from somebody in Adrian who knew a chef, and 5 of the workers were detained right then and there. They had their papers, but they didn't have their papers on them. So it's important that if you know somebody that has work papers, they've got to carry them with them at all times to make sure, because the rules that I knew before of sanctuary are not the rules that are happening right now. So on that happy note, we can move on to questions.
When I was thinking about Dr. Jill coming and looking at possibility of this congregation and this community working together to respond, I thought, but what do we do? How do we make this happen? And this is the lady who's walked the walk. So if she has brought some things up that have registered questions in your mind, please just raise your hand, and Pastor will come around and let you ask your question. If you don't want to speak on the mic, you can fill out a card and just have your question brought up.
I'm going to bring the microphone over here, and then if there's anybody who doesn't want to ask a question out loud but would like would like to write it down, I'm going to watch for people to do this. Motion at me, and I'll come around with paper and pens.
I'm just curious about the language barrier. Is that a problem? And do you have interpreters?
Great question. So when we decided to be a sanctuary church, I decided I needed to learn more Spanish. We've had people that speak Portuguese, Albanian, and 2 French families. So it's difficult. The family that we have now, the gentleman only speaks French and is illiterate. So it's very, very difficult. His wife, we do Google Translate, but I put out the call if anybody had a French translator, and a lovely woman stepped up and has been very helpful when we need to have really long conversations. We just put it out on Facebook and found a wonderful person.
I was curious about the children that you mentioned in the Detroit area that are not being provided education. Is there any programs that help those children get education either online or at home, or are they just going without schooling because of the fear?
As far as I know, I don't think any programs are in place right now. And besides that, I wanted to also mention that a lot of migrant churches have now gone on strictly online worship because they're afraid. So I don't know if there's any programs in place right now.
Hi, I have one from online. Is there a way to help the family that is currently in the church, in Detroit Central specifically? Fundraising, grocery store runs, driving children, etc. If we're a part of a church that is not currently helping a family ourselves, is there something we can do to help the family at Detroit Central?
Wonderful question. Dauda is the father who just lost his job, which was interesting when Jeremy was bringing that up in worship this morning. He just lost his job, and their second baby is due the end of this month. So fundraising would be great, but also getting him a job, because it's important for him to be the breadwinner of the family, and he was very proud that he had this job. So looking for that. The mom stays home and raises his son, who is 2 today. And I have been adopted as the grandma, so I spend a lot of time there too.
Now seems like a good time for me to reiterate an announcement that we made at Court Street this morning. You may know that the last several months there are nonprofit organizations that have been helping families seek asylum here in Flint. We've got dozens of new families who have come into Flint mostly from parts of the world that are experiencing conflict. The organization that was helping those families transition and settle in Flint has lost its federal funding. There are no grants coming that were promised. And so what that means is that many of these families have already integrated into the community. Many of them have found work and are fully part of Flint. There are 15 people who are looking for jobs right now so that they can support their families through this transition period. They've lost the time that they had because they had support from this organization. And so we've just been made aware that there are 15 families who are looking for 15 jobs at $15 an hour, preferably somewhere with access to a bus line. And so please use every platform that you have. Please reach out to your connections in the community. And if you become aware of any job opportunities, reach out to me, reach out to Court Street United Methodist Church, so that we can help these families stabilize and get back on their feet. This is an acute situation and a pressing need. So you don't wait on that. Have those conversations this afternoon or tomorrow.
Thank you. You indicated that you had a vetting process. Criminal background checks is one thing. That vetting process, would you recommend to be tailored to your accommodations? As an example, you had one of the family members that had beginning signs of MS. So we got medical coverage. Right now we're all don't know what's going to happen with Medicaid. And the costs that are associated with scripts and everything else. So how did you address your vetting process?
It's a great question. I was approached about this family with the understanding that Flora was already in a wheelchair, and we had to figure out if the apartment would work for her before we even talked to the family to make sure that that was possible. But also with the understanding that a lot of times when Flora had to go to the hospital, I was the one who got the phone call. I was the one that took her to the hospital because Dad couldn't leave. And he was even terrified to call the ambulance because the police came with the ambulance. So those are some things that your congregation, if you're approached about a family, to look at all of those logistics. And if you're taking on that family and they're on Medicaid, but all of a sudden their Medicaid is stripped, how are you going to fund them? So really to have those difficult conversations about, can we really, really take this on? There are some families that are a lot easier than other families, for sure.
That was your question. Okay.
So when you house a family, do members of the team take turns staying 24 hours a day, or are they in that sanctuary by themselves at night? What are the logistics of that?
So when you house a family and you vetted them, hopefully that they have their own private space, if it's a Sunday school room, if it's part of the fellowship hall. But no, they had keys to the church, and we had no incidents or anything. So we made it feel as much as home as possible, and we had absolutely no issues.
I didn't mean to imply there could be issues with them. I meant as a protective layer for them.
Yes. No, because the church is pretty much locked up, so nobody could get in. I will say, when Dad and Flora first moved in, ICE did circle the parking lot a lot. And I think that they just got bored after a while. But they were there a lot at the very beginning.
This is a question that maybe it's kind of dark, but like overturning stones and analyzing things. There was a slide up there that talked about how I can't remember exactly how it was worded, but it was about being basically, now I'm losing my thought. I'm not losing my thought. I'm just trying to find the words. If you were found guilty of harboring people or whatever, and it said that they had not done that for a long time or whatever. So my question is, if a church houses someone and they're found guilty, is it the entire congregation that ends up in a felony, or it's the pastoral staff, or, like, what direction does that go? Because if a church is considering doing this, there are people who are going to wonder, like, how much am I putting myself at risk? And there are some people, like I would be one of these people, who say, I really care, because I really don't care. But there's people who do care, or there's people who need to understand I'm not sure my question's clear, but I think you know the direction I'm going
Yeah,
in.
I don't know the answer to that. I think we're conference-wide. We're talking to the conference lawyer to see. So I don't know. Jeremy, do you know the answer to that?
The answer is, as far as I understand, it's not clear. A lot of things are not clear right now because a lot of policies and laws have changed just recently. And so we're in a little bit of a state of flux. One of the things that Dr. Jill shared with us is, when you ask the question, what even is harboring, she said it depends on who you ask. To give you just a little bit more detailed answer to that, I was in a meeting with an immigration attorney just this week, and he said really the answer to that question breaks down regionally, depending on what circuit court you're asking. And so there are parts of the country where harboring means you're hiding somebody. And so as soon as that person comes to your church, the first thing you do is reach out to the authorities and say, they are here, so nobody can accuse you of hiding somebody. There are other parts of the country where harboring seems to be interpretable as any assistance given in any way. And Michigan, unfortunately, is one of those any assistance in any way can be determined to be harboring, depending on what judge you ask and how they're feeling that day. And so we're in one of those areas of the country that's a little bit less safe in terms of harboring. Now, again, there's what administrations say and there's what actually happens. And so there's a lot of noise right now, but there have not been a lot of people arrested. There have not been felony charges filed. And as Dr. Jill said, sometimes that conversation just leads to the kind of publicity that you need to move a situation forward. So, all of that is a long way of saying, nobody knows.
Yeah, and I think about the publicity that if you had somebody in your congregation that's pulled out in the middle of worship by ICE and you film that and you let that go public, not going to look really good for this administration. So I think that they're not going to be likely to be doing anything that drastic, hopefully.
Addressing your statistics on the crimes committed by immigrants being less than that of the domestic population. We are here today mainly because of the toxic advertising from the Trump administration. This scares the general public. I have friends that constantly repeat this to me. It seems to me that it is mandatory that we push back with counter-programming to train the public that we're being fed lies, and response needs to be swift. And I don't know if we need to contact our congressional representatives, which would make sense, but also if there'd be a way to have a fund drive so that we have the monetary at our disposal to immediately launch an anti-lie campaign.
I'm going to take that point, and I'm actually going to turn it into a question because we have a number of clergy in the room today, and so I want to ask Dr. Jill, what kinds of conversations did you have as a clergy person with your congregation? In what ways did you build a culture that supported sanctuary ministry at Detroit Central?
Well, Detroit Central is unlike any church that you will ever know, and Martin Luther King preached there on several occasions. We housed conscientious objectors. We were part of the Free Press strike that was their headquarters. So it's not a congregation that I really had to have a lot of conversation with. More of a conversation of, I did get some scary phone calls. I did get a lot of hate mail, And I did at one point have to have people walk me to my car because that was scary. And so people were trying to protect their pastor and make sure that I was okay. There were times that I had to have a conversation that I just needed a break from all of it because it is exhausting. And I don't think we were ready to do what we did. We didn't have a committee. We just took this family in, and then we thought, well, we'll keep them safe, and then we'll figure this out. We're doing a much better job now because we went through 3.5 years with Dead and Flora, but to have the conversation, are you willing to be arrested if you need to block the door? Who are those people in your congregation that are willing to do that? There are some of us who are, and there are some of us who aren't. The other day, I just looked at my husband and said, yeah, I'm going to get a felony. I'm pretty sure I'm going to get a felony this year. Are you willing to do that? If not, who are the people that are willing to do that?
I had heard it was a requirement in order to be
It
a
was.
pastor at
It
Detroit
is.
Central. They don't even look at you if you don't have at least one felony.
So it is a requirement to be arrested as a clergy if you serve in Detroit Central. And I was down at the border, kneeling in the ocean, surrounded by Border Patrol, going, this is my moment, it's gonna happen. And they came up to me and went, are you doing okay? And I was like, no, arrest me. But it didn't happen, so.
If ICE enters and detains a person through a judicial warrant, are there next steps the congregation can take to help the detained person?
At that point, you have to have an attorney. There's nothing else. I mean, the congregation can let that information out and talk about that family and try to get as much publicity, especially if it's a sympathetic story. But as soon as they're detained, it's really only an immigration attorney that can take it from there. And there are very few immigration attorneys.
I will add one thing to that answer, which is if you are in a situation where ICE has entered the building and is arresting somebody, first of all, again, record everything. And secondly, the important question to ask in that moment is, where are you taking this person? Because often ICE will take people across the country to facilities far away from where they were arrested, and their attorney has no way of even finding them to get into contact with them. So if you do end up in that situation, the important question to ask is, where are you going with this person? They may not give an answer, but you got to ask, you got to try to find that information.
Yeah, the immigration attorney that I work with now has a client that got moved 5 times in 5 days, and he couldn't find him last time I heard.
Most of the time, our church staff are here, and they are not ministry staff or whatever. What are our protections for them? Because I don't know that we can ask them to commit a felony. They have life, some of them are working on not that large a salary and really cannot afford that kind of thing. So what kind of protection can we have for our staff when ICE comes to the door?
So like I said before, you have to identify those people who are going to have direct contact with ICE. Who's going to be the main spokesperson? If they come to the door, what's the protocol? If there's people on the staff that don't want to have anything to do with this, then have them move away. And the people that have said that I'm willing to take this risk, those are the people that need to come and deal with ICE.
I'm confused. Just when you think you know something, you find out you don't. I did know that it had to be a judicial warrant for someone to respond to ICE, that if it was not judicial, they did not have to respond. But I was surprised to hear, because we are within 100 miles of the border all through Michigan, that was new information. So you also mentioned that because of that, you can be asked for your identification, and that's not just, that's me who was born here, that's every single person, whatever their status. So how do those two things go together? The fact that there has to be a warrant, but because we're within 100 miles of the border, we have to be able to show our identification.
You could also say, I'm going to reserve my right to remain silent. And I don't consent to any of this. I mean, you might be arrested, but you have those rights. You can state right up front, I don't feel comfortable with this. My daughter Clara found a place that had cards that immigrants or anybody can have that say, I'm going to use my my right to remain silent. I do not, please let me go. Am I free to leave? Is a great question. You can ask that too. And if they have no way to hold you, then you can leave. But that's one of the things, I'm going to remain silent, and if they keep asking you questions, just say, am I free to leave?
Question for clarification on that point. My understanding, and I want to double check to make sure I'm understanding this, because we're in that 100-mile zone, you can be pulled over, your car can be searched, you can be asked for identification, but still, if they're going to enter a private space like a home, they need a judicial warrant. So the car is a little bit different from the home. A church is a little bit fuzzier space because some parts are public, some parts are private, but even within that 100-mile area, they can't just come into your home or your private space without a judicial warrant. And the other thing is, even if they have that judicial warrant, and if they have the judicial warrant, you can't keep them out. They're coming in. If they have that judicial warrant, though, that doesn't do anything to your Fifth Amendment rights, and so you just keep silent. Don't say anything. If I got that right, did that sound right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All
It's
right.
very impressive.
Two things. First, for the congregations that aren't part of the Methodist group, can we get a copy of your slides?
Yes, Jeremy has them.
Okay.
So, Jeremy, you can forward it. I'm a techno negative, so.
Second, to clarify the point about the CBP checkpoints, it means that they can stop you, but again, the same laws apply.
Yes.
So they can set up checkpoints in a way that they can't do in, say, Kentucky. So that's
correct.
the main difference.
Yes, correct. There was one time that Dad had a medical emergency, and I did have to sneak him into emergency. And that was terrifying, and absolutely nothing happened. But I didn't sleep the night before. I was absolutely worried that I was going to be arrested for having a fugitive in my car, but nobody knew. So.
One quick follow-up. If anybody wants to reach out to me or to Court Street directly, we can make the slides available. Also, even as we're live streaming, everything is being recorded. And so after you leave today, you'll be able to go and check our social media, our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and the recording of this entire event will be there for you whenever you need it.
This is kind of a follow-up to my other one. How do you go about finding a lawyer? Is there someone in the area that we know of, or what is the process to find one? Or is that on the person who's detained?
The way we found one is we declared ourselves a sanctuary church, and we worked with Michigan United. And then because of that, there was an immigration attorney who is also a professor at U of D Mercy, who brought his class in to meet Dad and to hear Dad's story. And then from that, when Dad moved out, all of a sudden I got phone calls going, hey, I've got this family, and I know you have a space. So that's kind of how we connected. But he's been amazing. I mean, I don't know how he makes a living with doing this work. But when I heard somebody reached out to me about the chef who had 5 people detained, I said, what do I do? What do I tell them? And he said, just give them my phone number. So they are few and far between, but if you can find an immigration attorney who's willing to work with you, that would be, I only know of one, and that's who we work with and who checks out the family before we ever meet them.
I'm confused as to why Dev has to stay hidden and his wife and his child don't have to.
Oh, so when they appealed their deportation, when they left Albania, it was not a democratic country. And when they applied for asylum, it became a democratic country. So they were ready to deport them because it was fine to go back. And then Flora was diagnosed with MS. So she was given a humanitarian stay because she could not fly more than a half hour. So to deport her would mean, she would die. So that's why she's allowed to stay. And I believe we worked out a deal with the government that Dad can stay as long as he is her caregiver. Should she pass away, then I believe his deportation would start all over again.
If my memory serves me right, your families are located on the 7th floor.
The 5th floor.
5th floor, thank you. I needed that to be qualified. Has ISIS ever penetrated that private space?
No.
Have they ever requested
No.
to go to the private space?
Never. Never. So far, yes. So far. I mean, we were very public, and all of the news stations covered it. Fox 2 used to come every 6 months and do an updated story. And as soon as sensitive locations was taken away, Channel 2, 4, and 7 were back at Central to say, okay, how are you going to deal with this? It's very difficult to find the apartment on the 5th floor, and we've instructed everybody in the congregation that you have no idea where that apartment is. Just, you know, you're welcome to look, but it's really, really hard to find it. Even if, you know, you are a congregation member, it's really hard to find.
Thank you. Just wondering about, for like physical arrangements, is anybody doing sanctuary not on site in the church? Is anybody doing it in the community, in private homes that are undisclosed, anything like that?
I believe people are housing immigrants. It's not safe to do so. Sensitive location is still sensitive location, but a private home is not covered by that. So, and there, like I said, a lot of the denominations are suing the government right now. But a private home is not considered safe. And we're even looking at unused parsonages right now, and we're not sure that that is covered under sensitive locations either.
I have one question. We were talking at lunch. You didn't go this alone. You were part of a community of helpers. And since the group here today includes people from other churches and community agencies, could you help us a little bit figure out how that network can work to support Safe Sanctuary?
Yeah, so once a congregation decides they're going to house, they need to reach out to all of the other denominations in the area saying, we're about to take this family in. Are you willing to help? What are the ways that you're willing to help? Are you willing to help financially? Are you willing to help with grocery shopping? Are you willing to help with, you know, taking to the doctor? Are you willing to give therapy? Because there's a lot of trauma involved in this, not only from their home country, but trying to get into this country, there's a lot of trauma. So we would meet once a month with all of our different partners to talk about, and there were different partners for when we walked to Lansing. That was a whole different group of people that decided that they were going to walk alongside of us. There were different people who would help with meals and driving to school and that kind of thing. But people would just reach out and say, how can I help? And I would say, here are the things that I need. Or you know, just have them on speed dial ready to help whenever. And this is the situation that we have.
This might not sound like a serious question, but it is. How do we get your shirt?
This shirt came from Amazon, I hate to say.
I thought maybe it might be something you created.
Oh,
and
no,
see
no,
if we could
no.
get your rights.
This is from
But they're on
Amazon. Yeah. Oh, I'm sure that there's, yeah, but don't look at all of the stuff that are shirts about immigrants, just the good stuff.
Whose hand was up over here? Linda, was it you?
I was going to ask the same question.
Okay.
Jeremy, you could send a link out too on how to get this shirt.
Right. We're not doing Amazon right now. I love you, but we're not doing
know.
Amazon right now. We just canceled our Prime membership.
Jeremy showed up at church one Sunday wearing a cool sweatshirt that he bought right here in Flint by a black-owned business, and I'd like that information. And would they make a shirt like this?
Yeah, support black-owned businesses, support local businesses.
There you go. And I do have a shirt that says "Granddaughter of Immigrants" that I got on Etsy. So there's that. That's a small business too.
What do you do with families that are, some part of the family may be illegal, some of them may be legal, depending on what their situation is? Have you ever had that kind of situation?
I have not had a mixed status family that I have worked with, so I wouldn't know how to answer that one.
I don't have an answer for that either. You're not surprised. All right. I think I'm giving you like a last round call here. Any other questions? Anybody who's been really shy and hesitant and sitting on a question, afraid to raise your hand, now is your opportunity. All right, so here's how we're going to close our time together. We do. That is under the wire, Kathy.
I'm just going to yell out. What churches in Flint have showers?
Excellent question.
That is a good question. Off the top of my head, correct me if I'm wrong. Did I just hear somebody say People's Church has showers? People's Church does. I think St. Paul's does now. No, St. Paul's does not. Right, okay. There's a shower, but it's outside, right? And so you use it at your own risk. Yeah. Okay. That's right. Okay. Yep, they have a shower, but they're using it for another ministry. Right. Okay. Calvary United Methodist Church has showers. Are we aware of any other churches that have shower facilities in Flint? I don't know that there are that many. That would be something. But the thing is, even a van requires somebody to leave the building, right? And that's the thing that we're not doing. Not that I've heard of.
Are there organizations to partner with that would put in maybe Habitat for Humanity or Communities First, or have any churches had those conversations yet with the other organizations to say we have a space in the building that would work if somebody could put it in?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, there's volunteers in mission groups all the time that you could ask if they would come in and build a shower. That migrant grant would give you the seed money to do something like that. The church that I talked to last week, it was very interesting that they started out with like, well, there's no way we could do this. And at the end, they were going, well, we do have a basement, and there was a kitchen that was there one time, so we could put the kitchen back in there. So there are ways of thinking outside of the box to how you can do it, even if you don't have the facilities now. Can you dream of a way to make that happen?
Yeah, and I think a lot of congregations, right? And the reason that you're here is because you've been asking your question for several weeks now. Is there something I can do? I feel like I want to do something. What can we do? And so you saw this event and you came hoping you could find something to do. Maybe that's a first step for your congregation, is to start a conversation about installing some plumbing, and see if you can raise some interest and some money for that. Whether or not you ever end up providing sanctuary, there are plenty of ways to use showers in ministry, and so maybe that's a good first step for some of our congregations right now. Thank you for asking that question. All right, I am going to make that the last question. I'm going to give in just a moment moment, I'm going to give Dr. Jill the opportunity to tell one last story and give us a sort of a poetic benediction. And then I'm going to, don't anybody jump up and run out after the poem, because I'm going to make an invitation to all of you after that. So just stay put for a moment. All right, Dr. Jill.
Okay, so when we were walking to Lansing, one of the volunteers that walked with us was a Holocaust survivor who was 82 years old at the time, who drove me nuts because he would walk against traffic with the sign, "Keep Families Together," and I would scream at him all the time. He passed away recently, and I went to his service, and they read this poem at the end of his service, and I just wanted to share this with you. Active hope is not waiting to be rescued by the Lone Ranger or some other savior. This hope is waking up to the beauty of life on whose behalf we can act. We belong to this world. The web of life is calling us forth at this time. We've come a long way and are here to play our part. With this hope, we realize that there are adventures in store, strengths to discover, and others to link arms with. This hope is a readiness to engage and make connections, a readiness to discover our steadiness of purpose, our own authority, the liveliness of our curiosity, the unsuspected depth of our patience and diligence, and our capacity to lead. These are heavy days, and none of this can be discovered without risk. We may not know how our actions unfold, the impact they might have. Sometimes the only thing we can do is to do all that we can. But we do need to step outside of the room where everything is known. And we do need to hold each other. Everything is impossible. Everything is impossible until it isn't. Thank you.
Would you please take a moment to thank Dr. Jill? All right, I'm going to cut you off before her head gets too big. So three things I want to say. The first thing I want to say is thank you. I love this community. Flint is such a beautiful and compassionate place. And I look around this room and I see so many partners in ministry, so many people who work every day, every week to care for our neighbors, to make community happen here in Flint. As we figure out what our ministry looks like from here, I'm confident that God will work through this network, and that there will be grace and there will be compassion and generous hospitality. Somehow we will do that together. Thank you for coming and taking this step with us. The next thing that I want to say is don't anybody run off. We've got refreshments, and we would love for you to stick around a little while and meet somebody you haven't met. Say, oh, well, how did you end up here today? What organization or what church are you with? Or did you just hear Dr. Jill was coming and wanted to get an autograph? Like, how did you end up here today? Right, so stick around, have a little bit of food, and do some of that community building before you go back to wherever you started the day. And then the last thing I'm going to say is please remember that there are families in our community right now who have visas, who have work papers, who have social security numbers, who have just lost their support and are desperate to find work so that they can support their families. Please, again, work all of our networks and connections, and if you hear about any employment opportunities that might work out for these families, please reach out to me so that we can help at least some of these families by the end of this week. I would be very grateful for that. All right. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit remain with us always. And also, whatever God you believe in, may you feel the presence of that God. I want to be as ecumenical and non-denominational as I can, and I'm not very good at it because I'm a Methodist. But I try, and sometimes it's the effort that counts. All right, go find some food and go make some friends, everybody, and thank you for coming today. That's connectional ministry. Vivian, thank you so much. I'm so glad that